In our pre-race show for the French Grand Prix, we looked back at the beginnings of auto racing, and we promised a second part on the early history of the sport. Now, the modern era of Grand Prix racing began in 1950, but the 1930s was a glorious period. It was a time of magnificent cars and drivers who were larger than life. For the first 3 decades of the 20th century, French, Italian, German, and American auto manufacturers battled on the road courses of Europe and America and took turns winning the major races as technology inched forward year by year. In 1934, 2 German manufacturers began to revolutionize and dominate the sport. Even today, the Mercedes and Auto Union Grand Prix cars that they built are an inspiring sight. The Germans advanced metallurgical science and built lighter cars and more powerful engines with the new alloys. Their chassis were built with lightweight tubing that gave more rigidity and strength, and they developed independent suspensions which gave them better traction and cornering. Their opponents' flexible chassis design and firm suspensions with rigid axles couldn't compete. And Auto Union designer Professor Ferdinand Porsche broke new ground by placing the engine behind the driver, a concept that would re-emerge in Formula One 2 decades later. Before a 3-liter engine limit was instituted in 1938, the Mercedes and Auto Unions were producing 600 horsepower and were capable of well over 200 miles an hour. That on tires that were only 4 inches wide. In 42 Grand Prix from 1934 to 1939, Mercedes won 19, while Auto Union won 14. The Mercedes were easier to drive and usually had more power, but in the hands of Bernd ROSEMEYER, the Auto Unions enjoyed great success. ROSEMEYER's natural balance, learned while racing motorcycles, enabled him to tame a beast few could handle. His greatest year was 1936 when he won the German, Swiss, and Italian Grand Prix, as well as 2 other significant races. Only 1 year after appearing on the scene, the 27-year-old dashing driver was the Grand Prix driving champion and idolized in Germany. But as quickly as he entered racing, he was gone, killed on the Frankfurt-Darmstadt Autobahn in January of 1938 when a gust of wind threw him off the road at 240 miles an hour during a land speed record run. Rudolf CARACCIOLA was the most successful driver from the inception of the first Drivers' Championship in 1935 until war ended racing in 1939. The German driver of Italian heritage was the Mercedes standard bearer and won the drivers' titles in 1935, 37, and 38. Now, like all great drivers, CARACCIOLA was primarily a very quick driver with a fierce commitment to win. But what set him apart was his patience and smoothness. He understood what would happen to tires and brakes if pushed too hard over the course of a 3-hour race. He was acknowledged as the rainmaster of the pre-war era, and along with Stirling Moss, he was the only non-Italian ever to win the Mille Miglia. He was one of the sport's great tactical thinkers and one of the coolest under pressure. If CARACCIOLA was ice, TAZIO NUVOLARI was fire. The most talented driver of the era, NUVOLARI was one of the greatest masters of car control of any era. He was flamboyant and daring, seemingly possessed to be the fastest driver every time he got behind the wheel of any type of race car. NUVOLARI's legacy and his legend is perhaps best summed up by his drive in the 1935 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. After dropping to 5th place, he brought his outdated and underpowered Alfa Romeo up through the field and defeated the Mercedes and Auto Union teams. As he had so many times, the wiry little Italian had defeated better machinery with his superior skill and tenacity. In the early 30s, he dominated Grand Prix racing while driving for Alfa Romeo. But it wasn't until 8 years later that NUVOLARI finally got to race for Auto Union. And of the last 7 Grand Prix before the war, he won 3. Racing ended in 1939 as the world had more important things to think about than sports. War was the only thing that could have stopped Mercedes and Auto Union from dominating racing for years to come. Just this year, Rudolf CARACCIOLA and TAZIO NUVOLARI were inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in ceremonies you may have seen on Speed Vision.